In the 1930s, there was a country in Africa that had done something very few others had managed to do. It had remained independent while much of the continent was taken over by outside powers. That country was Ethiopia. For decades, it had stood on its own, with its own leadership, its own history, and its own way of life. But that independence also made a target. Because in Europe, there was a government that had not forgotten a defeat from years earlier. And this time, it was preparing to return with far more power than before. What followed was not just a war between two countries. It was a test of whether independence could survive against a modern, organized invasion. And once it began, it changed far more than just the outcome of a single conflict. In the early decades of the 20th century, as European powers extended their influence across Africa, one country stood apart in a way that was both unusual and significant. Ethiopia, located in the Horn of Africa, had managed to maintain its independence during a period when much of the continent had come under colonial control. Its history, geography, and political structure had allowed it to resist outside domination, creating a sense of continuity that few other African nations could claim at the time. This independence was not accidental. It had been shaped by earlier events, most notably the Battle of Adwa in 1896, when Ethiopian forces defeated an invading Italian army. That victory had established Ethiopia as a sovereign nation in the eyes of the international community and had left a lasting impression both within the country and beyond it. For Ethiopia, it was a moment of strength and unity. For Italy, it was a setback that remained part of its national memory. As the 20th century progressed, the political environment in Europe began to change. In Italy, a new form of leadership emerged under Benito Mussolini, who came to power in the 1920s. His government emphasized expansion, national strength, and the idea of restoring influence abroad. Within this framework, Africa once again became an area of interest. Ethiopia, with its history of resisting foreign control, held a particular place in these ambitions. For Italian leadership, it represented both a strategic objective and a symbolic one. The earlier defeat at Adwa was still remembered, and there was a desire to reverse that outcome and establish a stronger presence in the region. At the same time, Ethiopia itself was undergoing its own internal developments. Under Emperor Haile Selassie, who came to power in the early 1930s, efforts were being made to modernize aspects of the state. These included administrative reforms, attempts to strengthen the military, and engagement with international organizations such as the League of Nations. Despite these efforts, Ethiopia faced significant challenges. Its military structure was not as centralized or technologically advanced as those of European powers. Equipment varied widely, and while there were attempts to modernize, these changes required time and resources that were not always readily available. Meanwhile, tensions between Italy and Ethiopia began to rise. Incidents along the border between Ethiopian territory and Italian-controlled regions, particularly Eritrea and Italian Somaliland, created points of friction. One such incident occurred in 1934 at a place known as Wal, where clashes between forces from both sides heightened the situation. The Wal incident became a focal point in the growing dispute. Both countries presented their perspectives to the League of Nations, which was intended to act as a forum for resolving international conflicts. While discussions took place, they did not lead to a resolution that satisfied both sides. As diplomatic efforts continued, Italy began preparing for a larger military campaign. Troops, equipment, and supplies were moved into position in Eritrea to the north and Italian Somaliland to the southeast. These preparations indicated that a broader conflict was becoming increasingly likely. Ethiopia, aware of the situation, also began to mobilize its forces. However, the scale and organization of this mobilization differed significantly from that of Italy. Ethiopian forces included a combination of regional armies, each led by local commanders, along with the imperial army. While many soldiers were experienced and familiar with the terrain, they faced limitations in terms of modern equipment. By 1935, the situation had reached a point where war seemed unavoidable. Diplomatic channels had not produced a lasting solution, and military preparations on both sides had advanced significantly. In October of that year, Italian forces launched a full-scale invasion of Ethiopia. The attack came from multiple directions, with troops advancing from Eritrea in the north and from Italian Somaliland in the southeast. This marked the beginning of what would become known as the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. The initial stages of the conflict reflected the differences between the two sides. Italian forces were equipped with modern weapons, including artillery, aircraft, and mechanized units. They were organized into structured divisions and supported by established supply lines. Ethiopian forces, on the other hand, relied heavily on numbers, local knowledge, and determination. Many soldiers were armed with rifles, though not always of the same type, and some units still used traditional weapons. Communication between different groups could be challenging, and coordination across large distances was not always consistent. Despite these differences, Ethiopian forces did not simply withdraw. Instead, they engaged in a series of battles, often making use of the terrain to their advantage. The mountainous landscape of Ethiopia played a role in shaping the early encounters, as it influenced movement and visibility. As the war progressed, the Italian advance continued, supported by its technological advantages and logistical organization. At the same time, Ethiopian forces attempted to resist and slow this advance through both direct engagement and strategic positioning. Beyond the battlefield, the conflict also drew international attention. Ethiopia appealed to the League of Nations, seeking support against what it described as an act of aggression. The situation raised broader questions about collective security and the effectiveness of international institutions in preventing conflict. The response from the international community was mixed. While some measures were taken, including economic sanctions against Italy, they were limited in scope and did not significantly alter the course of the war. This outcome would later be seen as an indication of the challenges faced by international organizations during this period. As the early months of the war unfolded, it became clear that the conflict would not be a brief one. The scale of the invasion, the determination of both sides, and the broader political context all contributed to a situation that would continue to develop over time. The Ethiopian-Italian War was entering a phase where the initial movements would give way to more sustained and complex engagements, shaping the direction of the conflict in the months that followed. As the invasion moved beyond its opening phase in late 1935, the war began to settle into a pattern shaped by geography, logistics, and the very different structures of the two forces involved. The Northern Front, where Italian troops advanced from Eritrea, quickly became the central focus of the conflict. It was here that some of the largest and most significant engagements would take place. The terrain of northern Ethiopia played an important role in shaping the course of the war. Mountain ranges, high plateaus, and narrow valleys created natural obstacles that influenced movement and communication. For Ethiopian forces, this landscape was familiar and offered certain advantages. For the Italian army, it presented challenges that required careful planning and adaptation. Italian commanders approached the campaign with a structured strategy. Their forces were organized into divisions supported by artillery, engineering units, and aircraft. Supply lines were established to maintain a steady flow of equipment and provisions, allowing them to sustain operations over long distances. Roads were improved or constructed as the army advanced, making it possible to move heavy equipment through difficult terrain. Ethiopian forces, by contrast, relied on a more decentralized system. Regional leaders commanded their own armies, bringing together large numbers of fighters who were motivated by loyalty, tradition, and the defense of their country. While this allowed for rapid mobilization, it also made coordination between different groups more complex, especially when facing a highly organized opponent. One of the early major confrontations on the northern front took place near the region of Tembien. Here, Ethiopian forces gathered in large numbers, attempting to halt the Italian advance. The scale of these formations reflected both determination and the importance of the moment. However, the outcome of such engagements was shaped not only by numbers, but also by differences in equipment and coordination. Italian forces made extensive use of artillery and air power during these battles. Aircraft were used for reconnaissance as well as for attacking positions from above, providing a level of reach that Ethiopian forces could not match. Artillery allowed Italian units to engage targets at a distance, shaping the battlefield before ground forces moved forward. These advantages became more evident as the fighting continued. Ethiopian forces, despite their numbers and familiarity with the terrain, faced increasing difficulty in responding to coordinated attacks that combined multiple forms of military capability. Communication challenges between units further complicated their efforts to respond effectively. Another important series of engagements took place in the region of Ambayeredam. This area, characterized by its elevated terrain, became the site of intense fighting as Ethiopian forces attempted to hold their positions. The battles here reflected the broader pattern of the war, where determination and local knowledge were met with organized strategy and technological support. As the campaign progressed, the Italian advance continued, though not without resistance. Ethiopian forces repeatedly attempted to regroup and challenge the movement of the invading army. These efforts slowed progress at times, but the overall direction of the conflict remained unchanged. At the same time, the southern front, where Italian forces advanced from Somaliland, developed in a different way. The terrain here was less mountainous, and operations were shaped by different logistical considerations. While the northern front remained the primary focus, the southern advance added pressure by opening another direction from which Ethiopian forces had to respond. The coordination between the northern and southern fronts allowed Italian forces to maintain a steady advance. By applying pressure from multiple directions, they limited the ability of Ethiopian forces to concentrate their strength in one area. As the war continued into early 1936, the scale of the conflict became more apparent. Large movements of troops, extended supply lines, and ongoing engagements across multiple regions created a situation that required sustained effort from both sides. For Ethiopia, the challenge was not only military, but also organizational. Bringing together different regional forces into a unified response proved difficult, especially under the pressure of continuous advances. Despite these challenges, resistance did not collapse. Instead, it adapted, with forces repositioning and continuing to engage where possible. Internationally, the war continued to attract attention. Reports from the region described the scale of the campaign and the methods being used. While the League of Nations had already taken limited measures, the ongoing developments raised further questions about how the situation would be addressed. However, the overall response remained constrained, and the conflict largely continued along its existing path. The limitations of international action became increasingly clear as the war progressed. By the middle of the campaign, it was evident that the Italian forces were steadily moving closer to the central regions of Ethiopia. The combination of organization, equipment, and sustained logistics allowed them to maintain momentum, even in challenging conditions. At the same time, Ethiopian forces continued to resist where they could, often regrouping after setbacks and attempting to make use of the terrain and their knowledge of local conditions. This resistance, though facing increasing pressure, remained an important part of the conflict. The war was now entering a decisive phase. The early encounters had given way to larger, more coordinated operations, and the outcome would depend on how both sides managed the challenges ahead. The events that followed would determine not only the direction of the campaign, but also the future of Ethiopia as an independent nation. As the war moved deeper into early 1936, the fighting across northern Ethiopia became more intense and more sustained, shaped by the steady advance of Italian forces and the continued efforts of Ethiopian armies to slow that movement. What had once been early clashes had now turned into a prolonged campaign across the highlands, where both sides were committing large numbers of troops in an attempt to control the key routes leading toward the interior of the country. Italian forces continued to advance from Eritrea with a careful and methodical approach. Their commanders focused on maintaining strong supply lines while moving forward step by step, securing each position before pushing deeper. Roads were repaired and extended as they progressed, allowing artillery, vehicles, and reinforcements to move forward more efficiently. This logistical stability gave them a consistent advantage, especially in a landscape where movement could otherwise be slow and difficult. Ethiopian forces responded by gathering in large numbers in regions such as Tembian, Shire, and Amba. These areas became the focus of major engagements, as Ethiopian commanders attempted to block the advance and defend the paths leading toward the Central Highlands. Tens of thousands of fighters assembled under different regional leaders, reflecting both the seriousness of the situation and the determination to resist. The battles that followed were intense and often fought across rugged and uneven terrain. Ethiopian forces made use of their knowledge of the landscape, taking positions in areas that were difficult to reach and attempting to disrupt advancing units. For a time, these efforts slowed the Italian advance and created moments where the outcome of specific engagements was uncertain. However, the structure and coordination of the Italian military continued to shape the overall course of the fighting. Artillery was used to weaken defensive positions before infantry moved forward, while aircraft provided reconnaissance and allowed commanders to track movements across the battlefield. This combination of coordination and technology made it difficult for Ethiopian forces to maintain their positions for extended periods. In the battles around Tembian, Ethiopian armies launched repeated efforts to hold their ground and push back the advancing forces. These engagements lasted for days and involved large numbers of fighters on both sides. Although Ethiopian resistance was determined, the sustained pressure from coordinated attacks gradually forced many units to withdraw and regroup. A similar pattern unfolded in the region of Amba. Ethiopian forces used elevated terrain to establish defensive positions, hoping that the natural landscape would provide an advantage. For a time, this created strong resistance, but continued artillery fire and organized assaults eventually weakened these positions. As the battle continued, maintaining a stable defense became increasingly difficult. With each engagement, the Italian advance continued, sometimes slowed but rarely stopped. Their ability to maintain supply lines and coordinate movements allowed them to recover quickly after each battle and continue pushing forward. This steady momentum became one of the defining features of the campaign. At the same time, the Southern Front added further pressure. Italian forces advancing from Somaliland moved through different terrain, creating a second direction of advance. While this front was less central than the Northern campaign, it required Ethiopian commanders to divide their attention and resources, making coordination more challenging. Despite these difficulties, Ethiopian resistance did not collapse. Many units continued to fight, adapting to changing conditions and making use of local knowledge wherever possible. Smaller engagements took place alongside the larger battles, showing that resistance remained active even as the situation became more difficult. Emperor Haile Selassie remained closely involved during this period, working to manage the defense of the country while facing increasingly difficult decisions. The situation required balancing continued resistance with the realities of the battlefield, as the pressure on Ethiopian forces continued to grow. As the weeks passed, the Italian advance brought them closer to the central regions of Ethiopia. Roads and supply routes extended further into the interior, allowing operations to continue without interruption. Ethiopian forces, although still determined, were increasingly affected by the strain of continuous fighting and the difficulty of reorganizing after each engagement. The war during this phase followed a clear pattern. Ethiopian forces gathered in strength and resisted with determination, while Italian forces applied steady pressure through coordination, logistics, and technology. Individual battles varied in intensity and outcome, but the overall direction of the campaign continued to move forward. As the war moved into its final phase during the spring of 1936, the situation across Ethiopia had been shaped by months of continuous fighting, steady advances, and repeated attempts at resistance. Italian forces, having secured large parts of the northern highlands, were now moving with increasing confidence toward the central regions of the country. Their progress had not been without difficulty, but the structure of their campaign, built on coordination, logistics, and careful planning, allowed them to maintain momentum even as the terrain remained challenging. The advance toward Addis Ababa became the central focus during this period. This was not simply a military objective, but a moment that would define the outcome of the entire conflict. The capital represented political authority, continuity, and independence, and its fate was closely tied to the future of the country as a whole. As Italian forces moved closer, the pressure on Ethiopian leadership increased, and the decisions being made carried long-term consequences. Following the earlier battles in the north, Ethiopian forces attempted to reorganize and prepare for further resistance. However, the cumulative effects of previous engagements were becoming more difficult to overcome. Many units had been weakened, supplies were limited, and communication across different regions remained a challenge. Despite these difficulties, resistance did not disappear. In several areas, forces regrouped and continued to oppose the advance, though often with fewer resources and less coordination than before. One of the most significant efforts during this phase came at the Battle of Mechu in March 1936. This engagement represented a major attempt by Ethiopian forces to halt the advance before it reached the Central Highlands. Large numbers of troops were gathered under the direction of Emperor Haile Selassie himself, reflecting the importance of the moment and the determination to defend the country. The battle took place across difficult terrain, where movement was shaped by the landscape and conditions on the ground. Ethiopian forces fought with determination, attempting to use both their numbers and their knowledge of the terrain to challenge the advancing army. For a time, the engagement created uncertainty, as both sides committed significant resources to the fighting. However, the same factors that had influenced earlier battles once again played a decisive role. Italian forces, supported by artillery and aircraft, were able to coordinate their movements and apply sustained pressure across the battlefield. This coordination allowed them to respond to changing conditions more effectively, while Ethiopian forces faced increasing difficulty maintaining organized positions under continuous attack. As the battle continued, the pressure began to take its toll. Ethiopian forces, despite their efforts, were eventually forced to withdraw. The outcome of Mechu marked a turning point, as it removed one of the last major obstacles to the advance toward the capital. After this, the road to Addis Ababa became increasingly open. In the weeks that followed, Italian forces continued their movement southward. Their advance was steady rather than rushed, supported by supply lines that extended deeper into the country. Roads were used to transport equipment and reinforcements, ensuring that the advancing units remained supplied and organized. This logistical support allowed operations to continue without interruption, even as distances increased. At the same time, conditions within Ethiopia were becoming more uncertain. News of the advancing army spread, and the reality of the situation became more immediate for those in central regions. While resistance continued in some areas, the overall ability to organize large-scale opposition was diminishing. Emperor Haile Selassie faced one of the most difficult decisions of the war during this period. Remaining in the capital carried risks, both for his own safety and for the broader future of the country. At the same time, leaving would mark a significant moment in the conflict. After careful consideration, he chose to leave Ethiopia in early May 1936 with the intention of seeking international support and bringing attention to the situation on a global stage. Shortly after his departure, Italian forces entered Addis Ababa. The city, which had long served as the political and administrative center of Ethiopia, came under their control with relatively limited direct fighting inside the city itself. This moment marked the end of organized large-scale resistance and signaled the conclusion of the main phase of the war. Following the capture of the capital, Italy declared that Ethiopia was now part of its colonial empire, combining it with Eritrea and Italian Somaliland to form what was called Italian East Africa. This declaration represented a major shift, as one of the few independent countries in Africa had now been brought under foreign rule. However, even after this point, the situation did not become completely stable. In many parts of the country, especially in rural and mountainous regions, resistance continued in smaller and less organized forms. Groups of fighters remained active, carrying out local actions and refusing to fully accept the new conditions. These efforts did not take the form of large-scale battles, but they showed that opposition had not entirely disappeared. On the international stage, the war had drawn significant attention. Ethiopia had appealed to the League of Nations, and Emperor Haile Selassie later addressed the assembly in person. His speech described the events of the war and called attention to the challenges faced by his country. It became one of the most well-known moments associated with the conflict, highlighting the limitations of international systems that had been created to prevent such wars. The response from the League of Nations had been limited during the conflict, and the outcome further demonstrated the difficulty of enforcing collective decisions. Sanctions had been applied, but they were not strong enough to change the course of events. This raised broader questions about how international cooperation functioned during this period and what could be done differently in the future. In the years that followed, Italian control remained in place, but it was not without challenges. Governing such a large and diverse country required resources and organization, and resistance, although reduced, continued to exist. At the same time, global events were moving toward another major conflict, which would eventually affect the region once again. During the Second World War, the situation changed. Allied forces, along with Ethiopian resistance movements, moved against Italian control in East Africa. By 1941, Ethiopia regained its independence, and Emperor Haile Selassie returned to the country. This marked the end of the period of foreign occupation and the beginning of a new chapter.